Muted, and welcome everybody to the first annual, and we hope it's not the last annual, Landscapes of Poetry reading. These, we certainly hope you have a really good time. The poets this evening are members of this group that was started many years ago, 12, 13, 14 years ago, called the Landscapes of Poetry. It was the vision of Colette Wolkema de Nooyer to bring about a dozen people together and have me show them how to use a comma. And then it just kept going and going, and we're still together. Some people dropped out because of Zoom, but the wonderful thing that happened for all of us who stayed with Zoom was that we made Zoom disappear, and we hope tonight that happens for you too, as you just let the words float over you and daydream away. I can't thank my wife, Julie, enough, because I'm completely inept. As I said to her tonight, I make things up and she makes things happen. And so I'm incredibly grateful to her. We all want to dedicate tonight's reading to Colette de Nooyer for getting this whole thing started those many years ago. So sit back and just enjoy. I said I wouldn't read, but then there was an uprising among the buffalo, and so I said, okay, I'll read too. And so I'll start things off. That gets me out of the way. And I'm going to read one poem, and it's a Christmas poem, so that helps. In fact, it's called A Christmas List for Santa. A Wednesday afternoon with no thought of Thursday. 3 weeks fishing in the Upper Peninsula with my father. My father. Cups of tea, plates of sugar cookies, the first ones I ever made, the dough still sticking to my fingertips. Comic books from the late 40s, Little Lulu, the Green Hornet, Felix the Cat. Every creek from the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. The last page from 20 unpublished novels. The ease of a dog's sleep. A moon-draped evening among the birds in the hemlocks, any snow-covered pile of leaves. Photographs, I don't care how many, of my daughter just before she smiles for the camera. 7 moments with the lucidity of cutting yourself with a bread knife. What happens between what happens? And the liturgy of an old monk laughing. Now, our first poet tonight, yes, yeah, standing ovation. Our first poet tonight, I decided to have the best of the poets read first. And so the finest of these 10 poets will start things off, and that's G.F. Korreck. So we'll have GF unmute and hear 2 poems. Each poet is going to read 2 poems. And so we'll start with GF.
Thank you. A couple of quick things I'd like to mention. I'd like to thank 2 poets, both of whom I would probably not be here without. One is my friend David Cope, who I've known for half a century. I thank him for his support and for not making me drink beer. The second is Jack Ridl, for his grace, for his generosity, and for his inherent Jack Ridlness, which encourages us to always be ourselves, which leads me to the second point. I'm not wearing any pants. My first poem is something I actually saw, at least the first part of it will be clear what I saw. Yeah, it's called Goldfish. Late summer, in the middle of a grocery store, a man in his overcoat, on his blue walker, hat in his hands, He sits in front of an aquarium, his eyes fixed on goldfish. A few strands of hair linger at his collar. He holds his hat by the brim with the thumb and forefingers of each hand, then turns it without looking. Like those he watches, a passing moment in someone else's eye. Perhaps not long from now, his overcoat hung in the bedroom closet, his hat posed neatly on the dresser, he will lay in his bed for the last time, dream about what he loved, and wonder who will feed the fish. Second poem is a little bit lighter. It goes back to my days as a guilt-ridden adolescent in Catholic school. If anything went wrong in the school and the nuns asked who did it, all the boys would raise their hands. It occurred to me at one point in my history in that school that I was never going to get to heaven, but that maybe limbo was a possibility. So I wrote a poem called Shooting for Limbo, which didn't work, but it led to this poem. Thumbing through the magazines in the waiting room of the afterlife. The place was crowded. Duplo blocks littered the floor. Walkers adorned with orange and yellow tennis balls were jammed in the corner. Starbucks cups made rings in the fall teak tables. Everyone took a number. The line was up to 83,279 and spilled into the mall, most of the aspirants blocking the entrance to Best Buy. The few who found a spot on one of the now wobbled Herman Miller guest chairs were not inclined to talk. Their eyes wandered instead to the IKEA TV trays piled with magazines. The latest People featured Jesus and Magdalene in their new home, a Spartan cottage in a grove of olive trees. Sports Illustrated had a special cover. David Still King drops giant in rematch. Time was rebranded as Eternity. Barabbas was the lead story. Saint or Sinner, a fresh take. Men's Health devoted most of their summer issue to Methuselah and his secret for getting washboard abs at 962. Good Housekeeping highlighted a host of recipes for making casseroles with leftover manna. There were hundreds of word search books, mostly in Latin, and a puzzle book with a cheat on how to untie the Gordian knot. A stack of Nashville Enquirers was marked with a stamp that read, "All true." So we looked through them all, in between the coughing and random glances, too nervous to check our cells, which had no bars here anyway, too worried to watch the doors to see who was checking in or out. And when Mother Teresa poked her head from behind the plexiglass window and said, "Next," we all looked down, hoping our number was higher. Thank you.
There we go. Thank you, GF. I did an interview one time, and the interviewer really didn't know too much about poetry. Who does? But he said none of the poems that I'd written were poems, and I asked him why. Really? I said, really? I've wasted 40 years of my life, and none of these are poems? And he said, yeah, none of these are poems. And I said, why? And he said, because they don't rhyme. And I thought of that when you talked, GF, when you talked about David and Goliath, because none of David's Psalms rhymed either. So that guy, I'd like to see him say that to David. I think that would have been really fun to hear. Geez, David, none of these are Psalms. How come none of them rhyme? Well, that was our no, actually, that I reconsidered that. Actually, the next poet is the best poet that I've ever worked with. And that's Robbi Hartt. And what's so wonderful about Zoom is Robbi got to join us this year all the way from Massachusetts. So that's one of the great things about getting to do these things this way. I just otherwise she wouldn't be here. And I see a lot of other faces out there that wouldn't be here either if it weren't for it. So without any ado, here's Robbi Hartt.
Thank you. So thank you to Jack, who's made us better poets and better people. I'm reading two poems that are actually old poems that are sort of a tribute to the Berkshires, which was a place that we longed to be always and spent as much time as we could, and now live in full time. And I think that is what gets me through COVID. The first one is called Framing the Morning, written for Bob. The mist over the water beckons like a full moon, hovering over the hidden currents like vapors rising from secret springs in an unknown mountain village. We glance out the window, then at each other, knowing we can't wait for muscles to lose their morning stiffness. Soon the sun will stir the air, or children will wake and need tending, but this prize catch is shared only with the lone fisherman tucked in a corner of the first cove. It is holy, cupped in our palms like a chalice, reminder of our first taste of life and last hope for redemption. The birds trade their truths in small, stealthy movements, saying, "This is the pearl of the day," locked inside sky swirls of blue and gray. The quiet moment before the first worm appears, before the crows caw and circle. In the cool cover of dew, we are baptized again. You nest in the comfort of soft wood, old cushions, worn pages, while I sink into the cavity of a blue kayak, slip away from the dock, the gentle pulse of paddles pulling across the smooth water, rising up like a prayer with my quietest breaths. And the second one is called Marsh Lament, written for my children after they were no longer in the house and out of missing. They've boarded up the marsh, sealed it off with pressure-treated wood flanked by 2 PVC posts, stickers still on. It keeps the beavers from entering the lake, or perhaps the marsh, but most likely neither. The blackbirds cannot grasp the change. They screech their confusion from the underbelly of wild berry bushes and purple loosestrife, hoard their flashes of brilliant red and yellow, staying low, darting, not soaring. Still, I glide in stealthy silence to the throat of the marsh, hungry for something to surprise me. Sometimes it's the way the small striped bass blends in with the leaves from last season. Sometimes the yellow oar tugging the long stem of a single water lily. Sometimes the smooth arc of a swallow, dipping like a trapeze artist, or the sudden movement of startled ducks. Today it is the way a drifting tree trunk has come to resemble the turtle basking on its soft, rotting root, the way the minnows weave in and out of the spiny milfoil, and the leggy spider tightropes across its gossamer thread. The boat drifts absent-mindedly as I pause to write. The lake carries the laughter of fishermen and whispers of young children like a widow's offering to my waiting ears. I used to come to the marsh to get away, drink in the still open spaces before the house burst into its noisy routines, then return to poured pancakes, start coffee, catch the towels from the line. Now I picture all the pretty places you are exploring and try to remember the faces and fingers of each childhood. I see the rusty brace beneath the stones and wonder what it used to hold. The water dimples like antique glass. Tiny mosquito eggs travel downstream. A motorboat coughs to life in the distant cove.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Robbi. If some of you are new to poems, or some of you were victimized in school by being asked what a poem means, I should have said this at the beginning if any of you are new to this whole crazy art form. Poems, what does a tree mean? The best thing you can do for the evening is put away the word meaning and just say, have an experience with Robbi, who obviously misses not only her childhood, but also her children. And that's how we connect with one another. That's what makes us a family of human experience, not meaning. Well, I thought Robbi was the best poet I'd ever worked with, but you know, now that I think about it, Ruth Zwald, who also happens to be a shaman, is really the finest poet that I've ever worked with. There's no question about that. Ruth is actually our newest member of our group. Anytime there's an opening, if you want to join, let me know, and we'll see if we can let you in the door. So Ruth comes to us, Robbi comes to us from Massachusetts, and Ruth comes to us all the way from Fenville. Here's Ruth Zwald.
Oh, thank you, Jack. So happy to be here and be sharing with you all. So the first poem that I wanted to do is a narrative poem. It was a form that I really wanted to explore when I started working with Jack a couple of years ago. So this one I like in particular because it's a season of angels. So the title of the poem is "The Sky is What I Want to Tell You About." And now I am remembering a day when my footsteps were as heavy as my head, full of unknowns. Before I tell you about that day, I want you to know that the story turns out fine. Everyone is fine. It was just that day, that moment, that breath that I couldn't exhale. I'm remembering a day when my son lay in a hospital bed. I am remembering how I invent a routine to cope with the days of his recovery from surgery. Because don't we all create the familiar when there are tremors beneath our feet and we must survive right where we are? I rise early from my hotel sleep, exchange coins for a good cup of coffee, walk the short distance to the hospital as doctors and nurses and aides all pour in the door with me to face whatever the day holds. For 5 days, I clutch my morning coffee like a prayer. And the 6th day was the weekend. Suddenly, there was no line at the coffee shop, no bustle of staff at the elevator. Everyone else was home, yet my abode was the small chair next to the bed where my son worked to heal. On this 6th day, with coffee in hand, I pilgrimed toward the hospital, my eyes downcast, the furrow of my brow deep. You'd think I was divining the future from the laces of my shoes. I couldn't see any further. Did I mention there was no one else on the street? Suddenly a voice says, "Hey, you okay?" I glance up and a kind young man gazes back at me. "You know," he intones and smiles, "you just have to keep looking up." He walks past me. I stop my journey. Was he really wearing a trench coat? I turn to look, and there is no one there. The sky is what I want to tell you about on one day when the earth was heavy. The second poem I'd like to share is actually a new one, and it was inspired by the last poetry gathering where we talked about titles. And it's also appropriate because it's a seasonal one. So it's not, it's new. So here's the title. If I were a contestant on the British baking show Holiday Edition, and we were instructed to make a festive bread from our ethnic tradition, my 65-year-old hands would be kneading a dough enriched with butter and eggs and scalded milk and sugar, laden with stewed raisins and candied cherries. This stolen recipe from my great-grandfather, carried from Germany in 1885, where he was a baker before immigrating. And I have no idea why he did not become a baker in Minnesota. And I have no idea how one could create such a bread without a heavy-duty dough hook on the electric mixer. Instead, he had only a wood stove, rising and baking loaves in the cold, cold northern December darkness. And now I am imagining my grandmother at 65 making this bread. Though then not yet a grandmother, as her only surviving child, my father, would not marry till later in life, and she would not become a grandmother for another 7 Christmases of Stollen making. As her small body and slender hands pull and stretch the heavy dough with a strength she was rarely given credit for. On the baking show, the judge will look at my finished loaf, drizzled in powdered sugar, picking it up to feel the heft of it, cutting it, admiring the fruit spread evenly throughout, proclaiming it delicious, but judging that the whole loaf is a bit plain. Thank you. Such a joy to share. Thank you.
Oh, I'm so glad to hear that one. Yeah, so glad. Remember after a reading with Galway Cannell, this little kid came up to Galway and said, "It sounded like you were trying to sing." And I thought that was just so wonderful because in one sense, and Galway Cannell in his great resonant voice looked down and he said, "Yes, that's what we poets are always trying to do. We are always trying to make the language sing." So thank you for making the language sing. And now all the way from Traverse City, came all the way down here to be on Zoom. We have Beth McBride, whose claim to fame is that she was our daughter's first babysitter. Our daughter now has only 3 more years in jail, and all shall be well. Beth tells the story of little Meredith, our first babysitter, Beth. Beth said, "Oh, Meredith, look at the bird out the window." And Meredith said, "That's not a bird, that's a cedar waxwing." And we've had to live with that ever since, that kind of decision. So thank you, Beth, for being our daughter's first babysitter and staying with us all these years. I mean, just think how long that's been. That's so wonderful. Beth was in class with me at the college and then our babysitter. And now here she is with all of us tonight. So here's Beth McBride.
Came back.
And I left out that Beth is really by far the finest of all the poets that are here tonight.
Well, thank you, Jack. And thank you to all the friends and family and to Colette as well for putting all of this together so long ago. My first poem is titled Ode to the Picture Window, and it is real proof that the poem comes through the process of writing rather than the intent for writing, because it became something on its own. While writing it, I was struck by how much a window that we use to view the world can function in the same way as a parent does in explaining life to a young child. And I'll let you hear that here. Ode to the Picture Window. Praise to you who brings me light, who gathers warmth, allows the breeze, protector and overseer of this house. You frame perspectives, shield from rain, from hands reaching in, from worlds falling out. You reveal stars in the darkest skies, outline the basket of the night, string lustrous beads after the storm, foretell the birth of each new day. You harbor the moments as I look out toward indistinguishable horizons, capturing stillness here within while the waves thrash all around. I lean against your slender frame, forgetting your influence of my views. How much wider the world may be, the brace I'll need against the wind. And then, as the year draws to a close and 2020 becomes hindsight at last, perhaps we may notice that our desires have actually been refined by the uncertainties that swirled around us all year long. And in that spirit, I offer this poem. It is called Prayer for the New Year. Bless the new in this new year, please. Help us know it as renewal. Renew all through the great healing we can give to one another with authentic full attention, greetings, gestures, hugs, and handshakes, treasures we are waiting for. Bless the new in this new year, please. Help us be sources of comfort for those seared by loss and longing, haunted by despair and distance, cries unanswered, words unspoken. Help us fill the wells of heartbreak and release love's flow again. Bless the new in this new year, please. Help us come to know what need is, how it reaches from the shadows, out of hungers, out of troubles, out of fears that blind its stumbles, not toward things, but toward their stewards. Teach us how to truly give. Bless the new in this new year, please. Help us yield our understandings. Help us recognize our insights, our assured and firm conclusions are no larger than what we've lived, and make room for truths as valid and real in others as our own. Bless the new in this new year, please. Turn our eyes to focus forward, shirking blame and retribution for the vision of becoming people who know of their context here in this shared sphere of wonder, individuals together, choosing harmony as one. Bless the new in this new year, please. Renew our health, our strength and vigor, mend our spirits and our compassion for each other, our awareness of the sacred gift of being in the presence of another. Give us each other, please. Renew us. Thank you.
Well, you can see how lucky and fortunate I get to feel every time these people come together and give us all these gifts that's come together. Actually, I've been wrong now 1, 2, 3, 4 times in a row. Actually, the finest poet that I've ever worked with is going to read next, and that's Jeff Munroe. Jeff is widely published, but he's finally learning how to write. And from all these other, one of the great things about our group is that we all learn from one another. You know, I always leave going, oh man, I'm going to steal that. I'll steal that from Jeff. it's really quite a wonderful thing. One of the things that I've recognized about this long period of time of isolation in this COVID business, and we're not going to talk about that tonight because we're in the real world tonight. I get so tired of hearing people talk about what the real world is as if they know what it is. Isn't that hilarious? Don't you know somebody who knows what the real world is? That just kills me, you know? Yes, I'm escaping from the real world. I'm reading Crime and Punishment. But what I've learned is an expansion of companionship. I've just found instead of feeling closed in, actually our place has gotten bigger and bigger because we've become so, we've become such companions to every little thing that we've just kind of taken for granted, sat on that shelf all those years. And now they're kind of our pals, and they're always there in the morning waiting for us, and really grateful for that. So now for our finest poet, even though there are some other poets to come, but this is our finest poet, at least as far as I'm concerned, and that's Jeff Munroe. Here's Jeff.
Thank you, Jack. My friends and family agree with you. This year in our landscapes group, we focused on poems that touched on delight in one way or another. And so these are two poems that I wrote this fall that both touch on delight. And the first one is called Maps Are Us. The all-time coolest store I have ever been in is in Seattle and sells nothing but maps. I am a sucker for topography and scale, plates and plats, legends and keys. There are atlases and globes and maps, intricately folded like origami, and extra special maps that lie flat in thin, long drawers. And I wish I lived in the map store, so late at night, when no one was around, I could open a drawer and pull out a map and find my way. And my second poem is called Forests of God. Forests. I'm not saying that word. My diction's not all it should be tonight. Forests, you know, where trees grow. That's what I'm trying to say, not forest. Forests of God. I misread fingers of God as forests of God, and am happily transported to dark woods that breathe, adorn, delight, provide, sustain. I rise up the branches of the ancient prophecies, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, gopher wood and the cedars of Lebanon, the bow tree and the banyan, olive and acacia, Sherwood forest and Burnham wood. But the book says we must be fingers of God, not forests of God. Fingers pick and prod and poke and point. I deflate. God deflates too. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff. Our next poet is Marianne Maver. Marianne is also a masseuse, and I think there's some kind of metaphorical thing going on with that, because in many ways her poems are do what the masseuse also does for us, and we're very grateful for that. So for that reason alone, she's the best poet among this group. And here's Marianne Maver.
Okay, I am unmuted, correct?
Correct.
Yep, okay, alrighty. The first poem I'm reading is part of my series of poems that I'm writing about, compiling, that take place in Vermont, are sort of loosely based, somewhat not loosely based on family members, my mother's family. And these are meant to be read with an old Vermont accent, which I don't have and which very few people have anymore. So those of you who are familiar with a sort of Northeast Kingdom brogue, I guess you would call it, I can sort of insert that if it's possible for you to do that. This one is called Pie to be Had. Grammy told the story how on a summer morning when she was a little girl, when the bread was baked and the donuts were done, her mom, Big Grammy, would sometimes bake a pie. Blueberry, gooseberry, boysenberry, apple, flouring up the summer kitchen counter, rolling out the crust, tenderly lifting it, gingerly placing it into the pan, weighting it down, filling it with fruit, fingers dancing as they crimped the edge. And after supper, after the dishes were done, Big Grammy would start the coffee, put out the cups and saucers, the plates and the forks, the china creamer filled with the morning's cream, the sugar bowl with a silver spoon. Great Gramp would hang the lantern up out back. Leah and Duncan, in their house up in the woods, would see that as their sign. There was pie to be had at Emma and Carl's. Grammy got to stay up late, special nights like those. Grammy remembered standing at the back door, watching over the field for the bobbing of their lantern, the two figures becoming larger, emerging out of the mountain's shadow. She listened to them coming closer, cheery Leah with a voice like a song, Duncan with a voice like gravel. They'd all find a seat around the dining table. Little girl Grammy, her legs so short they didn't reach the floor. Big Grammy and Great Gramp on either side, Duncan and Leah across. Grammy served the pie and the coffee, and they'd get to catching up. Oh, the gossip, the jollity. Whose cows got into the beans and the milk tasted like sulfur? Who fell down drunk on Saturday night and didn't crawl home till Sunday? The smart-ass New Yorker who thought he'd pulled one over on Great Gramp, offering a pittance for a pile of cherry wood he assumed was good. Great Gramp knew it was rotten. Great Gramp cackled with laughter telling the story. He thought I was a bumpkin. I showed him. And then he come back complaining and I said, a deal's a deal. Little girl Grammy watched and listened and learned the ways of the world. And then it was late and they all had to get up to milk or to cook the next day. Leah and Duncan would gather themselves, light their lantern and depart. Little girl Grammy, standing sleepy, leaning against the edge of the door. Great Gramp calling out over the field, now Leah, you be good to him tonight. And Big Grammy chortling, chastising him, Carl, behave yourself. Peals of laughter echoing in waves over the field from end to end as the lantern light bobbed away and disappeared into the dark of the mountain. And this one is Ghost in the Machine, January 1st, 2015. Finally, the winds died down. It rumbled through in icy blasts all night so loud, I never heard the New Year's gunshots, firecrackers, cowbells, the hoops, the hollers. I went straight to bed at 10, rode the blue satin coattails of the tempest deep into sleep, dreamt of New Year's past, of my mother dressed in black velvet shot with gold, sipping champagne, her voice a zephyr, my father in a starched white shirt, bow tie, the red silk vest she sewed for him, my father laughing, a roar like the wind. I skirted midnight, then was wide awake again at 2. Wind throbbed like the red-eye prop plane we took from Midway to LaGuardia at Christmas when I was 3. Earaches and tantrums and oatmeal on the airport coffee shop floor. My mother grips my wrist. I attempt to twist away, a little whirlwind. Now the morning's still. My living room's a mortuary piled high with boxes, junk from my folks' estate to sift through, find a place for, save, or guiltily discard. Last night I pulled the picture window curtains closed to keep the wind from surging in. The New Year's amber daylight seeps through now. My cell phone rings. My brother's name, same as my father's, shows up on the screen. I answer, no one's there. I call right back. I wake my brother up. He says he didn't call. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mariana. One of the things when you're teaching, well, especially if you're teaching beginning students around age 18 or first year students in college, it's very difficult to help them find and relocate their world, because it's mostly been taken away from them by studying everything else, and what they learn is everything else is of more value than their own world, which used to always break my heart. And I've spent just as much time trying to lead the students back to find their world. And Mariana, you reminded me of the student who came in one time and said, I can't think of anything to write about, which used to drive me crazy, but I wouldn't let him know. But anyway, I said, well, why don't you write about your grandmother? And she said, oh, I don't want to do that. Everybody writes about the grandmother. And I said, oh my God, who the hell was your grandmother? How did I not know this? So finally, I think we understand how wonderful that is with Mariana's preservation of what really matters. Another example of one of the hardest things about writing a poem is, of course, your own dealing with what's within yourself, and trying to cope with sometimes being taken by surprise by grief or laughter or whatever it is that you didn't expect was in there. And anyway, that's so a student, again, had a trauma, a very sad situation. And I said, he said, I don't think I can write about it. And I said, well, just, you want to try? And he said, yes. And I said, well, then just go ahead and try. And he got out what he needed to get out. The poem wasn't, it was really drafted out, and that was fine. But he made the mistake of showing it to a colleague. And this colleague then came up to me rather rapidly and said, you teach this guy, don't you? And I said, yeah. And he said, well, you taught this? This is terrible. This poem's awful. And this is what you're doing? And I just looked at him and I said, do you know the value of it? And then I just walked away. Get things confused pretty easily. So Mariana, thank you for preserving that family. And I hate to disappoint you, but actually our best poet's coming up next. And that's Mary McSchmidt, who has devoted so much of her life to concerns of the water, has written a memoir about her life on the high seas with, I see Ruben sitting there, on the high seas with Ruben, and really deserves one of those prizes that people get who don't deserve them, and for her work with water. So here now is our really our best poet, and that's Mary McSchmidt.
Thank you, Jack. I'm blushing. I can feel it. You know, it was my mother who, speaking of families, it was my mother who actually first introduced me to poetry. She was trying to convince me to quit sucking my thumb when I stood about as tall as a kitchen chair. And so she gave me the book, A Child's Garden of Verses, written by Robert Louis Stevenson. And I lived within the covers of those books. The poems and the illustrations became the fabric of my dreams. But then I think, like many people, I put the dreams up on the shelf and spent many a decade pursuing a successful career in business, until one day I started reading poetry again. And now, thanks to Jack and the poets within landscape, I'm beginning to learn to write poetry. Such a gift. Thank you all. This first poem was inspired by my mother-in-law, who could make the best darn pies in the land. And she passed earlier this year. She passed on Easter Sunday in the first wave of this pandemic, which meant that neither her son, my husband Reuben, or I could be at her side. The poem is titled, Her Heart Was in the Sugar. It would be heavenly if she could see her children on the front yard again, glance at them through the window above the sink as she fills the house with the sweet smells of her baking. If, when she called them for dinner, they came running, knowing what was waiting in the oven after vegetables. If only she could again use lard in her crusts, ample sugar in her fillings. If only she didn't have to worry about her health or theirs. She lies on the kitchen floor, staring at the dark spot on the ceiling above the oven, trying to ignore the pain slicing through her side. How long ago was it? That day smoke filled the kitchen. That day her children told her to quit baking. That day everything changed. She hears a strange voice calling her name, asking if she is all right. Commotion in her entry. Closing her eyes, she smells the fragrance of a freshly baked pie, sees angels bounding in her direction, notices God reaching toward her, a dessert plate between thumb and forefinger, and hopes she remembered to add enough sugar. So the second poem, thank you. The second poem is inspired by my dad and dedicated to both my mother and my dad, who taught me the value of lifelong learning, but it's also dedicated to all teachers. And it is titled, The Accounting Professor. He could have been a coach, he recalls, idly fingering the Rose Bowl ring just pulled from the battered chocolate candy box he keeps in the middle drawer of the dresser. He remembers that first touchdown pass in high school, the eruption of the crowds, the smiles in the hallway the next morning. No one ever again called him white trash, accused him of being from the wrong side of 4th Street. It had been a tough decision, coaching or teaching. But if he became a teacher, he could help even the short, skinny kids cross 4th. He pulls the game ball given to him by his buddies from behind the books in the closet. He grips it tightly, remembering the dean's reprimand earlier in the day. Too many students doing too well in your Accounting 101 class. He's told to adjust his curve, fail more students, shrink the number daring to dream they can graduate from this prestigious business school. His job, he's reminded, is to weed out the unworthy. He returns the ring to the rightful place, but the game ball, signed by every coach and player of that national championship team, he carries to the kitchen table and places beside the stack of papers waiting to be graded. I could have been a coach, he mutters aloud, but I know I'm a damn good professor. Thank you.
Oh, boy. Thank you, Mary. That really rings home, doesn't it? What's really of value there? Well, our next reader is by far the finest reader, poet. So she needs no introduction, so here she is. Actually, we're all deadly afraid of Peg Padnos because she can do the New York crossword puzzle in the morning in 4.5 minutes. And so every time Peg goes to read, when we get together, everybody grabs a dictionary and just wonders where she got those words. And she looks at us like, what, you don't know that, what that word is? What do you mean? What do you mean? You don't know what the word is? So, Peg, it's just a delight to have your vocabulary with us and for you to come along with it. So here's our finest poet, Peg Padnos.
Thank you, my dear poet friends and my wonderful teacher, friend, and mentor, Jack. I tell everybody when they ask, how are you doing with this pandemic thing? I say, I can still have my poetry classes and I still study with one of the best poets in the whole United States. He's a dear friend. He's my wonderful friend and teacher. And yeah, I love crazy words. I just love how they sound. I hear a word, I say, oh, I like that word. I heard, on the NPR, I get all these great words. I write them down or something. So I'm a registered nurse from mid-career change. I became a registered nurse in my mid-40s, and I love nursing. I'm retired now, and so now I'm just a full-time poet. And I still love the lexicon of nursing and medicine and science, and so biology. So my two poems have to do with that. The first is part of a chapbook I've been working on for quite a while. It has to do, we call them the nurses' notes in the hospital, all the charting that nurses do. And this one is called COVID Blues, and it's in the voice of a nurse. I've never attended anybody in the hospital with COVID, but other things, of course, but not COVID. But this is what I imagine it might be like. COVID Blues. Pale blue scrubs, masks, latex gloves, for us more than for the patients, so we can safely do our jobs, stepping into their pain, flinching from our own when they sneeze or cough, even as we try to look them in the eye, try to reassure, one way or another we'll get through, even as we breathe in, breathe out each other's air. Sometimes there's little we can do to keep them off the vent, their lungs, fields of ground glass, cytokines amassing for the storm. But sometimes the fates cryptically align when we flip our supine patients into prone, turn the flow of O's to high, sit by the bedside, chat about the weather or this nether world we're in, and wait for the rise in saturations, the dropped heart rate. This slow-mo abracadabra, this shell game of meds, dexamethasone, remdesivir, Regeneron, algorithmic brains on a tear, doctors prowling the edges of distant galaxies, as if searching out some magic bullet spawned from a dispensary in space. Should the patient start to breathe more easily at last, we sigh, more surprised than relieved, more likely feeling awe instead of thanks. In the night sky beyond the windows of the ward, a comet on course, strewing in its wake that telegenic trailing sneeze, stardust and frozen gas. Thank you. The second one is more about, I guess, general biology and the wildlife around us. We are so fortunate we were able to spend almost half the year at our cottage on Lake Michigan. And we are very happy hosts to the birds of the seashore, especially a species called swifts. And these are chimney swifts. And the poem I wrote in response to a prompt I had to find something from the natural world and research it and figure out what you could do with it in terms of a poem. So this is what I came up with. It's called Cottage Swifts. In our periodic cleaning of the hearth, we find clues, spent eggshells from 4 or 5 hatchlings, ghostly thumbnails left behind, sometimes dead baby birds, bodies as soft as kneaded dough, or mummified remains fallen, most likely flung from an overcrowded nest. Only a couple of inches long, this specimen oddly reminds me of a dinosaur, premature, its neck craning forward, as if trying to discern the living room beyond the soot-stained brick of that careworn fireplace. The more I learn, the more I want to know. Small comfort sought in these pandemic times. The less I understand, the more I want to steep myself in lore, awed by enigmatic souls whose chittering I've heard. Will I ever really see them on the wing? These creatures said to copulate in flight, to bathe in mists of gently falling rain that may or may not mate for life. Creatures that season after season inhabit my chimney walls, patrons of an avian B&B that requires guests to make their beds, quite literally, to create a custom nest. So they do, snatching myriad materials, ad-libbing from the air, twigs from arboreal crowns, brittle grasses, pigeon feathers, rose petals, newspaper scraps, bits of tin foil, every kind of chaff, husk, hulls, seed pods, even live butterflies, spit gluing the mix of media into a sort of sagging pouch that looks by turns like a hobo bag, a pelican's jowls, the bowl of a meerschaum pipe. I want to understand how physiology marries with the mysterious divine. Vesper flight, half the swift's brain asleep, its other half awake. Bedroll of barely moving clouds, images drifting out of dreams, whisper of wing flap distilled to evensong.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Peg. That, and you're talking about nursing, reminds me that there was, I was going through one of my I've wasted my life periods. Those are often on Saturdays. And this time it was with a surgeon. And I said, you know, you're a surgeon, you heal people. And, you know, I just feel like I just wasting my time. And he said, no. He said, I don't heal anybody. I've never healed anybody. I just fix things in people's bodies in such a way that over time they come back together. The healing comes from, he mentioned the arts. He said healing comes from music and painting and sculpture and poetry and being good to one another. That's when healing happens. And I've held on to that a long time, and I'm grateful. We now moved from former nurse to former pastor, and that's Sharon Arendshorst, who actually I've realized now is the best poet I've ever worked with. Primarily, she started out as a formalist and wrote a lot of sonnets, and I went and learned about sonnets. So now I think that training did a lot for her. She's now by far the best poet that in this group. So here's Sharon Arendshorst.
Thank you, Jack. One of the things I really appreciate about Landscape is that Jack encourages us to write in our own voices. And as you could tell from this evening, no two of us sound alike. Each poet is unique. And that was all well and good until last year. And last year, Jack introduced persona poems, where all of a sudden we were to write in voices other than our own. We could write in the voice of someone who is very different than us, or in the voice of a rock, or a tree, or an animal, or a pet. So this first poem that I selected was a persona poem written in the voice of my son's dog, Koi. And so this is a persona poem. And I also chose this because pets, I think this year, the pandemic, have become very, very important to people. So it's the relationship with my son, but also the importance of pets. The title is Lost and Found. Lost and found. Picked up as a stray, the police took me to Harbor Humane Society. I lay on a low cot in a cage. My head rested on my paws. My eyes followed each person who walked by or stopped at other cages. Dogs barked and whined. I watched and waited. My family never came. One Thursday night, a man wearing oily jeans and work boots paused by my kennel. He called me Koi, the new strange name I'd been given here. He walked to the bars, sniffed his calloused hands. I gave my tail a wag or two. He said I looked like his pit bull Daz, who lives with his ex in Florida. He took me out to the exercise run. Off leash, I ran a circle, sniffed the many layered smells, retrieved an old rubber ball and carried it to him. He knelt beside me. He rubbed my head, scratched my ears, and stroked my back. I looked into his deep brown eyes and saw loneliness reflected there. I now live with the man. I'm his cinnamon shadow. When he comes home from work, I run to meet him at the door, wagging my tail so hard I shake all over. He grins, calls me wiggle butt, and drops to all fours to wrestle. I escape and run for my purple tug rope or a tennis ball. Outside, he flings the ball. I tear across the field, leap to catch a high bounce, and run it back to him. Later, we curl up on the sofa. He rubs my belly and talks to me. We sleep together, my back to his. Last night, as I crawled under our comforter, he took my face in his hands, rested his forehead on mine, and whispered, "Koi babies, you saved my life." And the second poem is written this year, this spring. I was reflecting on the last time we had company, the last time we had a party in our house. It is titled Gifts of Our Last Dinner Party, February 2020. A guest arrives with 24 red and yellow flame-shaped tulips tied with a golden bow. They ignite the evening, sparking joy and conversation. Another guest plays Bach on the newly tuned piano. We gather around our dining room table where candles flicker with our laughter, light dancing on open faces. After our guests leave, I place the tulips on the kitchen island. Their petals open more fully every day, stems arch low under the weight of the tulip's beauty, bowing in benediction.
Thank you so much, Sharon. We were on our way to have lunch with Tom and Sharon Arendshorst one time. And we got a phone call. We were driving, got a phone call, and it was the neurologist's office saying that I needed to get to the emergency ward as fast as possible, that I either had a few hours or a few days before I'd be paralyzed from the neck down. And I said, well, we're going to lunch at the Arendshorst, and could I stop over after that? And she couldn't believe I was serious. But Sharon and Tom, I see Tom there, that was a terrific lunch, and it was a great time. And they steroided me up, and I can move from the waist down. But it really was a terrific lunch. Well, I saved the best for last. I've been saying these other people were the best, but that's, you know, that's just a setup for Kathleen Markland, who is just one of the fine poets. Well, the finest poet. I saved her for last. They need to say nothing else, except that it's important to know that I think Kathleen was got the award as the outstanding award at Oxbow, you know, the art colony, for the Woman of the Year, for you know, contributions to Oxbow over the years. So it was really a high honor. And but the real reason I could save her for last because of that, but I'll save her for last because she is the best. Here's Kathleen Markland.
Well, thank you. I don't know how anyone could not love poetry with poets like we have in our group. So thank you. I'm going to read Lamentations. 'Tis the season before winter, when all that was serene has become chaotic. A blueberry sky spread like jam above a white pine wilderness, where airborne waterfowl drop like stones, broken with dawn's first blast. A transfusion of life-letting blood oozes from feathered breasts, permeating a sun-stunned pond. Beer-swilling spam eaters love their killing sport. And while I hate the sport as much as I hate the invasion of a suppository, I must admit I love roasted wild duck and the beer-swilling spam eater that kills them. Very Christmassy. Seasons of thanks. I thank you, Lord, for winter days with skies of hazeless blue, for snow shadow secrets on nights breath caught in moon-bright splendor, for spring's silent color creep that stirs the restless soul to seek, for early morning sun-struck mists that succor in the passing. I thank you, Lord, for summer's splash of flower pockets tucked into surprised corners of simple places, for unvarnished afternoons of quiet conversation, for autumn's sunsets that backlight and bounce, prismatic, rollicking, dancing into winter. Thank you.
Thank you all for coming. I hope you enjoyed and recognized who was best and how silly those awards are. Do be safe. And may you all be of good cheer and have many good moments of joy over these holidays. Happy Hanukkah. And thank you for caring about these 10 wonderful people. I'm a very, very lucky person.